Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly onto a narrow strip of sand where the sea breathes in long, even sentences, and you're standing there barefoot, toes sinking into cold grains while the horizon barely remembers how to glow. You smell salt before you see anything. That clean metal tang that Edo-Period fishermen would have recognized instantly because it meant work, routine, and survival were already awake. The coast is calm, deceptively calm, like a sleeping animal that could ruin your entire week if you misread it. You listen to the surf count time for you, and you realize this is not a romantic postcard life. You probably won't survive this if you expect comfort, late mornings, or personal space. Before we go any further, though, there's a small modern ritual to take care of. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment with your location and local time. It's oddly comforting knowing someone else is half awake somewhere else in the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're already awake long before sunrise because Edo-Period fishermen don't wake up early. They simply never sleep late. Your body knows the tide tables without paper because for most of the Edo period, formal printed tide charts weren't common at the village level. Instead, knowledge lived in muscle memory and muttered advice. Mainstream history tells us coastal fishing villages operated on tightly synchronized schedules, rising well before dawn to catch favorable tides, and you feel that discipline now, pressing you upright even when your eyes burn. The Tokugawa era prized order, and that order reached all the way down to when you rolled off a straw mat. You step outside, and the air is cool enough to sharpen your thoughts. The village is quiet but not asleep. Somewhere, a neighbor coughs. Somewhere else, wood taps softly as someone checks a hull. You're not special here, that's the point. Edo-Period coastal life emphasized group rhythm over individual preference, and if you're late, you're not quirky, you're a problem. Historians still argue whether this strict synchronization was enforced by village rules or simply evolved because the sea punished disorganization quickly and without apology. You glance toward the water and instinctively scan the sky. No apps, no forecasts, just cloud texture, wind direction, and the smell of the air. A sharp, dry scent suggests stable weather. A heavier, damp odor makes you cautious. There's a quirky tidbit here that sounds fake, but probably isn't. Some fishermen believed the sea smelled different on days when spirits were restless. And while modern science would call this humidity and pressure changes, nobody back then was interested in debunking what kept them alive. You file it away anyway because superstition costs nothing, and ignoring the ocean costs everything. Your clothing is simple, functional, and already stiff with salt from yesterday. Cotton or hemp layers, tied, not tailored. You don't dress for style, you dress for repetition. Edo fishermen often wore indigo-dyed garments, partly because indigo was cheap and partly because it was believed to repel insects and even minor infections. That belief sits right on the edge between folk medicine and practical chemistry, and historians still debate how much the dye actually helped versus how much people just noticed fewer problems and connected dots afterward. As you move closer to the shore, you feel the ground change under your feet, from packed earth to loose sand to slick, dark stones near the waterline. This coast isn't dramatic, no towering cliffs, no heroic waves, just a quiet Japanese shoreline doing the same thing it did yesterday and will do tomorrow. That sameness is comforting, but it's also dangerous. You remind yourself not to relax too much. Edo-Period fishermen learned early that calm seas didn't mean safe seas. Most fishing accidents happened on ordinary days, not stormy ones, because complacency is faster than waves. You pause and listen for birds. Seabirds matter. Their flight patterns hint at fish below, and while that sounds poetic, It's bluntly practical. This is one of those mainstream facts everyone agrees on. Fishermen across cultures used birds as living indicators of underwater activity. The quirky part is that some villages believed certain birds were unlucky at dawn, and if one crossed your path the wrong way, you'd delay your launch. Rational? Maybe not. But when your livelihood depends on thin margins, even irrational caution feels smart. Your boat waits where you left it, wooden, shallow, and unremarkable. No sails yet, no dramatic push-off, just quiet checking. You run your hand along the hull, feeling for cracks. Edo boats were typically small and purpose-built, optimized for nearshore fishing rather than long voyages. Japan's isolationist policies limited deep-sea trade for much of the period, so most fishermen worked coastal waters intensively. Historians still argue whether this encouraged sustainable practices or simply delayed ecological strain, until urban demand exploded later. Someone beside you yawns loudly and immediately regrets it because yawning is contagious and now you're fighting it too. That's joke number one for the night, by the way. Nothing bonds people like collective exhaustion. You suppress it and focus. Nets will come later. Right now, it's about timing. The tide doesn't care that you're tired. The tide doesn't care about you at all. You take one last look at the village behind you. Low houses, faint lantern glow, smoke just beginning to rise from early fires. These people depend on what you bring back, directly or indirectly. Edo cities, like Edo itself, modern Tokyo, relied heavily on fish protein, and coastal villages were quietly feeding one of the largest urban populations in the world at the time. That's the scale of what you're stepping into, even if your boat only holds a few nets and a couple of hopes. You inhale, steady yourself, and step closer to the water as the sky begins its slow shift from black to bruised blue. No announcements, no dramatic music, just the start of another day that looks exactly like the last one, and that's how you know you're doing it right. You don't rush into the boat yet. That would be sloppy, and sloppiness is how ropes tangle, nets tear, and mornings go bad before the sun even clocks in. Instead, you kneel on damp sand and start laying things out in the order your hands remember better than your brain ever could. This is where routine hardens into habit. Nets first, then lines, then floats, then weights. Same sequence every day. Edo-Period fishermen relied on repetition not because they loved tradition, but because repetition reduced mistakes when you were half awake and cold. Mainstream historians agree that this kind of embodied routine was essential in pre-industrial labor, especially in environments where errors were expensive or fatal. You lift a net and feel its familiar drag, heavier than it looks, smelling faintly of brine and old fish oils. These nets aren't mass-produced factory items. They're hand-knotted, often by family members during off hours, repaired endlessly rather than replaced. Cotton and hemp fibers dominate, and you already know which knots will fail first because they always do. Historians still argue whether fishermen themselves made most of their gear or relied on specialized net makers within the village. But either way, you're the one responsible once it's in your hands. You check the floats next. Wooden, sometimes cork, sometimes repurposed scraps, shaped and sealed. Nothing fancy. Edo Japan wasn't allergic to innovation, but it was deeply suspicious of unnecessary complexity. If something couldn't be fixed with basic tools and patience, it wasn't worth taking to sea. There's a quirky tidbit whispered in some coastal records. Certain fishermen carved small symbols into floats to confuse jealous spirits who might otherwise sink their gear. Whether this was genuine belief or just an excuse to personalize identical equipment is still up for debate, but you notice the marks anyway. The boat itself demands attention. You run your fingers along the seams, pressing gently. A soft spot would mean water seepage later, and later is always worse. Edo-Period fishing boats were typically clinker-built or simple plank constructions designed for shallow waters and easy beaching. They weren't elegant, they were obedient. Modern scholars point out that these boats balanced stability and speed surprisingly well, given their simplicity, though historians still argue how standardized designs really were across regions. Someone nearby sharpens a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. You don't need to look to know the sound. Knives matter more than people admit, used for cutting lines, cleaning fish, and sometimes, quietly, for protection if disputes got heated. Edo Japan was relatively peaceful under Tokugawa rule, but that didn't eliminate tension. Coastal resources were finite, and fishermen knew exactly where invisible boundaries lay. Whether villages enforced these boundaries formally or through quiet retaliation is something historians still can't fully agree on. You pick up a coil of line and test its flexibility. Too stiff means it'll snap. Too soft means it'll tangle. This kind of judgment isn't written down anywhere. It's learned by losing gear, losing time, losing money. That's joke number one for this section. Education here is expensive, and tuition is paid directly to the sea. You grimace, satisfied enough, and set it aside. As you work, the sky lightens further, revealing more faces around you. No one talks much. Conversation wastes breath and attention. When words do appear, they're practical. Winds shifted, nets fraying, birds are quiet. This isn't antisocial behavior. It's efficiency. Edo-period labor culture valued restrained communication, especially in group tasks. Historians often point out that silence functioned as a kind of respect, a way of acknowledging shared purpose without distraction. There's a faint smell of rice steaming from somewhere inland, and your stomach reacts before you can stop it. Breakfast will come later, maybe. Many fishermen went out on empty stomachs, believing a full belly made you sluggish and careless. There's no solid evidence this helped, but belief alone can change behavior, and behavior matters. Some fringe accounts even suggest fasting was thought to appease sea spirits, though historians still argue how widespread that idea really was. You tie the final knot and pause, hands resting on your knees. Everything is where it should be. Not perfect, nothing ever is, but ready. That readiness is the real tool here. Edo-period fishermen didn't control their environment. They negotiated with it daily, using preparation as leverage. The sea could still say no, but at least you weren't insulting it with incompetence. You stand, stretch your shoulders, and glance toward the water again. The tide is turning. That's your cue. All this quiet preparation wasn't filler. It was the difference between a workable day and a miserable one. You grip the boat's edge, feel the rough wood bite slightly into your palms, and signal to the others with a nod. No countdown, no speech, just motion. And as you start to push, you already know that everything you've just checked will be checked again later, repaired tonight, and laid out again tomorrow. Routine doesn't end. It loops. That's the deal you made when you stepped onto this coast. The boat is moving now, not fast, just enough that the water curls softly around the hull, like it's considering letting you pass. You settle into your place and let your eyes do most of the work, because this part of the day isn't about strength yet. It's about reading. The sea is a text, and you've been illiterate before, so you pay attention. Edo-period fishermen depended heavily on environmental cues rather than instruments, and this isn't folklore, it's mainstream history. Before modern navigation tools, survival hinged on interpreting patterns in water, sky, and animal behavior. And you're doing that now almost without thinking. You watch the surface of the water carefully. Small ripples moving against the dominant swell suggest something below is disrupting the current. Maybe fish, maybe rocks, maybe nothing worth your time. The trick is knowing the difference, and historians still argue whether this knowledge was consciously taught or absorbed through years of near failure and quiet correction. No one sat you down with a lecture. You learned because the wrong call meant wasted hours or torn nets, and those lessons stuck. Your eyes flick upward to the clouds, not the dramatic ones, the boring ones. Thin streaks stretching long and even usually mean stable conditions, at least for a while. Thick, uneven clumps feel suspicious. Edo fishermen didn't have meteorology, but they had pattern recognition, which is arguably the same thing minus the math. There's a quirky belief recorded in some coastal regions that clouds shaped like fish scales meant a good catch. And while that sounds charmingly ridiculous, you can't deny that certain sky conditions do correlate with fish behavior. Historians still debate how much of this was coincidence wrapped in storytelling. Birds enter your awareness next. You don't chase them, you observe them. A sudden dive, especially repeated dives in the same area, pulls your attention hard. Seabirds don't waste energy. If they're active, something is happening below. This is one of those facts nobody disputes. Birds are reliable indicators of fish movement. The fringe part is that some fishermen believed specific birds were messengers of sea deities, and if they screamed instead of diving, it was a warning to stay away. Rational or not, you notice the sound because ignoring warnings, real or imagined, never ends well. The smell of the air shifts slightly as you move farther from shore. Less plant matter, more salt, more openness. Your breathing slows without you telling it to. This is familiar territory, but not safe territory. Edo-Period fishermen worked close to land, yes, but close is relative when your boat is small and the weather can change its mind. Scholars still argue whether Edo fishing practices were conservative by necessity or by cultural preference. But either way, caution is baked into every decision you make now. Someone near you gestures subtly toward the water, 2 fingers pointing, then a slow circle. You nod. No words needed. That hand signal means, watch this area, not act yet. There's a patience here that would drive modern people insane. Joke number 1, if you need constant stimulation, this job would have killed you faster than the sea ever could. You sit with the quiet, eyes scanning, mind alert, but not tense. You adjust your posture slightly, keeping your weight balanced. Boats of this size respond to every shift, and stability matters when you're preparing to cast nets later. Edo fishermen learned early how to become part of the boat, rather than a load inside it. That sounds poetic, but it's physics. Historians still argue whether this skill was instinctive or deliberately trained, but the result is the same. You move carefully, economically, like someone who knows gravity personally. A faint shimmer beneath the surface catches your attention, not a splash, not a disturbance, just a change in light. Schools of fish can create that effect, reflecting dawn light in brief flashes. Or it could be nothing. The ocean is very good at lying. You hold the image in your mind and keep watching instead of reacting. This restraint is hard-earned. Edo fishing techniques favored efficiency over aggression. Casting too early meant spooking fish or wasting effort. There's a whisper of wind now, brushing your cheek. You tilt your head slightly, feeling its direction. Offshore wind is usually manageable. Onshore wind can push you back faster than you want. Sudden shifts are dangerous. Some fishermen believe the wind itself had moods, and while that sounds like personification, anyone who's spent time on open water knows the wind behaves less like a tool and more like a collaborator you don't fully trust. Historians still argue how deeply animistic beliefs influenced actual decision-making versus post-event explanations. You hear a low creak as the boat settles, wood responding to movement and water pressure. It's not alarming. It's conversational. Boats talk. You learn their language, or you ignore it and pay later. This particular sound means the load is even. Good. You relax just enough to keep your hands steady. Time stretches here. Minutes feel thicker. You're not bored. You're suspended. This waiting isn't empty. It's active. Edo fishermen spent large portions of their day in this state, watching and recalculating, and some scholars suggest this cultivated a kind of practical mindfulness long before anyone used that word. The fringe interpretation is that this waiting was spiritual, a form of meditation. The truth is probably less romantic. Waiting was unavoidable, so people learned to live inside it. Another bird dives, sharper this time, closer to where you noticed the shimmer. You exchange a glance with someone else. No excitement, just acknowledgement. That's confirmation, not celebration. You're getting closer to action, but not yet. You let the moment ripen. The sky is now a pale wash of light, the sun still hidden, but clearly on its way. This window, between dark and full morning, is precious. Fish behavior shifts quickly once the light strengthens. Edo fishermen structured their entire schedule around this liminal time, and historians still argue whether this was driven more by fish biology or by market demands for early catches. Probably both. The sea doesn't care about theory, though. It responds to light. You inhale slowly, exhale slower, and keep watching. Everything you need to decide will reveal itself if you don't rush it. That's the lesson the sea teaches over and over, and you're still learning it, one quiet dawn at a time. The decision happens without drama. No shouted orders, no sudden urgency, just a subtle shift in posture from the others, a shared understanding that it's time to move. You lean forward, grip the gunwale, and push. The boat slides off the sand with a muted scrape, then catches water fully, rocking once, like it's clearing its throat before settling down. This moment, launching, is small but communal, and mainstream historians agree it was rarely done alone. Edo-Period fishing emphasized cooperative labor, especially at the shoreline, because coordination here prevented injuries and damage before the real work even began. Your feet brace instinctively as the boat floats free. The water is colder than the air, and you feel it through the wood. Someone else gives a final shove, then hops in smoothly, practiced enough not to upset the balance. Boats like this were designed to be launched and beached daily, and historians still debate whether this constant dragging shortened their lifespan or actually kept fishermen more attentive to maintenance. Either way, you're not thinking about theory right now. You're thinking about staying upright. As the boat moves farther from shore, the village recedes quickly. Lantern light fades, sounds dull. The sea absorbs everything. This separation is psychological as much as physical. On land, rules are visible. At sea, they're implied. Edo Japan was famously orderly under Tokugawa governance, but that order thinned the farther you moved from official oversight. Historians still argue whether fishermen experienced more autonomy on the water or simply carried village discipline with them, like an invisible net. You pick up an oar and dip it in carefully. Not a full stroke yet, just enough to guide direction. The rhythm is slow, deliberate. Splashing wastes energy and advertises your presence to fish that prefer you invisible. Edo-Period fishermen favored controlled, minimal movement, and that restraint shows up in both written records and surviving illustrations. There's a quirky belief tied to this. Some fishermen thought loud rowing angered sea spirits, which is a nice myth layered neatly over good technique. The boat glides forward, and you feel the shift from shallow resistance to deeper, smoother movement. This is the edge of the known. Not dangerous yet, but no longer forgiving. You glance back once, then forward again. Looking back too often is pointless. Joke number one. Nostalgia doesn't help you steer, and neither does regret. Around you, other boats fan out, each keeping respectful distance. Not because anyone said so, but because everyone knows crowded water leads to tangled nets and ugly arguments. Edo fishing villages often had informal spatial rules, who fished where at what times, and historians still debate whether these were rigidly enforced or flexibly negotiated day by day. You suspect it depended on personalities as much as policy. The morning light strengthens now, turning the water from black to slate to a dull silver. Reflections make depth hard to judge, so you rely on memory. This patch has a sandbar. That one drops off sharply. You avoid one, aim for the other. These underwater maps live entirely in your head, updated constantly. Mainstream history recognizes this mental mapping as a core skill, though it rarely gets the attention it deserves because it leaves no artifacts behind. You feel a brief tension in your shoulders as the boat rolls slightly. A passing swell, nothing more. Still, your body reacts before your mind. Edo fishermen developed quick, almost unconscious responses to motion, and historians still argue whether this came from deliberate training or sheer exposure. Probably both. Either way, you adjust without thinking, keeping your center low. The silence out here is different from the silence on shore. It's wider, more absolute. Sounds carry strangely. A distant oar splash feels closer than it is. You keep movements small, efficient. This is not the place for unnecessary gestures. Another boat passes within sight, and you exchange a brief nod. That's enough. You're colleagues, not competitors, at least not yet. There's a moment where the boat aligns perfectly with the swell, gliding almost effortlessly. You don't celebrate it, you let it happen. Edo-Period fishermen didn't chase ideal conditions. They recognized them when they appeared and worked within them. Some fringe accounts describe fishermen thanking the sea softly at moments like this, under their breath. Whether that was gratitude or anxiety, dressed up as politeness, is still up for debate among scholars. You reach the area you've been watching, and the boat slows naturally as you lift the oar. The water here looks different, slightly darker, slightly textured. This matches what you saw earlier. Confirmation, not surprise. You glance at the others, and they're already preparing, movements quiet and synchronized. No one needs to say what comes next. The launch is complete. You're no longer a person on land preparing to fish. You're a fisherman on the water, committed to whatever the next hours bring. The shore is behind you, the sun is rising, and the day has officially started, whether it goes well or not. You reach for the net, and this is where patience turns into movement. Not fast movement, measured movement. Casting isn't a dramatic throw, it's a controlled release, like letting something heavy decide where it wants to go. Edo-Period fishermen favored techniques that minimize disturbance, especially fixed nets and hand-cast nets designed to sink cleanly rather than splash. That's a mainstream historical fact, and it matters because fish don't line up politely for loud entrances. You feel the weight leave your hands in stages. First resistance, then a brief moment of freedom, then the tug as the net settles and begins its slow descent. You don't watch the surface anymore, you watch the line. The tension tells you more than your eyes ever could. Too loose means drifting, too tight means snagged. You adjust with tiny movements, wrists barely rotating. Historians still argue whether this level of finesse was universal or limited to experienced fishermen. But the sea doesn't care about averages. It only reacts to what you're doing right now. The boat rocks gently as others follow suit, each net entering the water with quiet discipline. No one rushes to finish first. Speed here is a liability. Edo fishing culture prized consistency over boldness, and this shows in everything from net design to daily scheduling. A quirky tidbit floats around in old village stories. Some fishermen believed casting too quickly scared away shy fish, a category that conveniently included any species that didn't cooperate. Superstition or pattern recognition? Historians still debate it, but either way, you're not hurrying. Once the nets are set, you wait again. This waiting is different from earlier. Now it's heavy with anticipation, but you don't let that show. You sit, feeling the boat's subtle movements, counting breaths without meaning to. Joke number 1. Modern productivity culture would call this wasted time, and then promptly ruin the entire catch by checking its phone. You smile faintly and keep still. The sun is fully above the horizon now, light spreading across the water in soft layers. Fish behavior changes with light intensity, and Edo fishermen knew this empirically long before anyone wrote it down. Some species feed aggressively at dawn, others retreat as brightness increases. You're targeting the former, timing your cast to intersect with habit rather than chance. Historians still argue how detailed this ecological knowledge really was, but the survival of entire villages suggests it was more than guesswork. You feel it before you see it, a subtle increase in tension along the line. Not a jerk, not a pull, just weight where there wasn't weight before. You don't react immediately, that's important. Pulling too soon lets fish escape. Pulling too late lets them tangle deeper, which sounds good until you're the one untangling it later. You wait for the right moment, counting heartbeats, then begin the slow, steady retrieval. Your arms engage gradually, no sudden strain. The net rises, resistance increasing as water drains, and bodies shift inside. Someone nearby mirrors your movement, synchronized without planning. This coordination isn't accidental. Edo-Period fishermen often worked in teams precisely because shared timing reduced chaos. Historians still argue whether profit-sharing arrangements encouraged this cooperation or whether social pressure did the heavy lifting. The first fish breaks the surface, flashing silver in the growing light. Then another. Then several more. Nothing spectacular but solid, enough to matter. You feel a quiet satisfaction settle in, not excitement, just relief. That's joke number 2. Happiness here isn't joy, it's the absence of disaster. You guide the net carefully into the boat, mindful of spines and teeth. Injuries happen when you stop paying attention. As the catch accumulates, you sort quickly, hands moving from memory. Some fish go into one container, others into another. Size matters. Species matters. Edo fishing villages had informal rules about what was worth keeping and what wasn't. shaped by market demand and preservation capability. Historians still argue how much overfishing occurred during this period, but early regulations and customary limits suggest people were at least aware that resources weren't infinite. You cast again. Same motion, same care. The rhythm settles in. Cast, wait, retrieve. Each cycle slightly different, each demanding full attention. The sea doesn't reward autopilot. A sudden tug surprises you this time, sharper than expected. You adjust, shifting weight, tightening grip. The fish fights briefly, then gives. Not heroic, just alive. By the time the nets come up again, the boat smells stronger now. Fish oil, scales, wet rope. Your hands are slick, your forearms tired. You don't complain. Complaining wastes energy. Edo fishermen measured days not by comfort, but by output, and historians still debate whether this mindset was imposed by necessity or reinforced culturally. Either way, it's yours now. You glance at the sky. The light has changed enough to signal it's time to move soon. You won't push your luck. One more cast, maybe two. Then you'll head back, carrying whatever the sea decided to give you today. That's the deal. Always has been. The nets are in the water again, and now the waiting stretches longer, heavier, like time itself has slowed out of curiosity. This is the part outsiders never imagine correctly. They think fishing is action, casting, hauling, shouting. In reality, Edo-period fishing is mostly endurance wrapped in silence. You sit low, spine slightly curved, hands resting but ready, eyes never fully relaxed. Mainstream historians agree that fishermen spent more time waiting than working, and that this waiting shaped both their bodies and their minds. Your legs begin to ache first, not sharply, just a dull complaint from muscles held still too long. You shift your weight subtly, careful not to rock the boat. Even discomfort has to be managed politely out here. There's no stretching, no pacing. You adapt or you suffer quietly. Some scholars argue this cultivated unusual levels of physical restraint and emotional control in coastal communities. Others argue people were just tired all the time. Both can be true. The water surface is deceptively calm, but you know better than to trust it. Beneath you, currents slide in different directions, layers of movement stacked invisibly. You can't see them, but you feel their influence through the line, through the boat's faint drift. Edo fishermen understood currents intimately, even without formal terminology. They spoke of pulling water and sleeping water, metaphors that sound poetic but described real, repeatable conditions. Historians still argue whether this language reflected spiritual beliefs or was simply practical shorthand. Your mind starts to wander, and that's dangerous. You rein it in by focusing on small sensory details: the soft creak of wood, the faint slap of water against the hull, the smell of rope warming in the sun. This isn't meditation by choice, it's concentration by necessity. There's a fringe theory among historians that long hours like this contributed to the calm, restrained demeanor often associated with Edo-period coastal people. Or maybe anyone would seem calm if they were too tired to be dramatic. A ripple passes under the boat, lifting it slightly. Not a wave, something deeper. You freeze, not stiff, just attentive. Sometimes fish move as a group large enough to change the feel of the water. It's subtle and easy to miss if you're distracted. You weren't. You make a tiny adjustment to the line, easing tension without pulling. The net responds. You wait, minutes pass, or maybe longer. Time loses its usual shape here. Joke number one for this section: if you're the kind of person who checks the time every 5 minutes, the sea would have already humbled you into a very quiet person. You breathe evenly, keeping your movements minimal. There's a superstition floating around some Edo coastal records that speaking too much during this waiting scared fish away. Modern explanations point to vibration and noise traveling through water, but fishermen didn't need physics to justify silence. They just needed results. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were symbolic or empirically reinforced, but either way, you keep your mouth shut. The sun climbs higher, and with it comes a slight increase in warmth. Not enough to be comfortable, just enough to remind you that the day is moving forward, whether you want it to or not. Light penetrates deeper into the water now, changing how fish behave. Some retreat, others grow bolder. You adjust expectations accordingly. Edo fishermen didn't cling to fixed plans. They adapted constantly, because rigidity breaks faster than wood. Finally, there it is again. That gentle change in weight. This one's different from earlier. Slower, heavier. You don't rush. You've learned that impatience feels productive, but usually isn't. You tighten the line gradually, letting tension build evenly. The net responds. Alive now, full of motion you can't see yet. As you begin to haul, your arms complain properly this time. Muscles warm, then strained. This is work, but controlled work. No jerking, no showing off. Historians note that Edo fishermen valued efficiency over strength, partly because injuries meant lost income, and lost income meant real hunger. You're careful, not heroic. The net breaks the surface, and this haul is smaller than the last. Fewer fish. That's fine. Not every pull is a victory. You sort quickly, keeping what's worth keeping, releasing what isn't. Edo-Period fishing often involved selective harvesting, especially near shore, though historians still argue how consistent this practice was across regions. What's clear is that fishermen weren't mindlessly scooping everything they could. Waste wasn't an option. You notice a species you didn't expect, smaller, darker. That's information. Fish movement changes daily, sometimes hourly. You file it away. Tomorrow, or later today, that detail might matter. This is how knowledge accumulates here, not in books, but in quiet observations layered over time. The waiting resumes. Your hands rest on your knees, slick with water and scales. You don't wipe them clean. Clean hands don't last long anyway. You glance around at the others. Faces are neutral, focused. No one is bored, but no one is entertained either. This is the emotional middle ground where most of life actually happens, even if modern culture pretends otherwise. A sudden splash nearby breaks the monotony. A fish jumping clear of the water, gone as quickly as it appeared. You don't react. Jumping fish aren't always a good sign. Sometimes they mean predators below. Historians still debate how well Edo fishermen understood predator-prey dynamics, but experience taught them caution. You stay alert. Hours feel compressed now. The morning is nearly gone, and the light has shifted again. You check the sky instinctively. Wind remains manageable. Good. You won't push beyond this window, though. There's a limit to how much patience turns into profit. Past that, it just turns into risk. You haul the nets one final time. Modest return. Acceptable. You stow the gear carefully, securing lines so they won't tangle on the way back. This part matters as much as the fishing itself. Edo fishermen knew that careless packing punished you later when you were tired and in a hurry. Historians still argue whether such foresight was cultural or simply learned through repeated regret. As the nets are secured, you feel the mental shift. The active waiting is over. Now comes movement again. Your body thanks you for it, even as it prepares for the next phase of work. You look toward the shore, already thinking about timing, tides, and what happens once you land. The sea gave what it was going to give today. You didn't win. You didn't lose. You participated. And for an Edo-Period fisherman, that's enough to keep going. You turn the boat gently, not sharply, because sharp movements waste energy and invite mistakes. The nets are stowed, the catch secured, and now you're aware of something subtle but important. Tension has shifted. Earlier, everything leaned forward toward possibility. Now it leans back toward accounting. Edo-Period fishermen understood this emotional pivot well. The haul is done, and what you've caught must now justify the hours you spent waiting. Mainstream historians agree that this moment between fishing and returning was where quiet competition crept in. You glance at the containers, doing mental math without numbers. Weight, variety, size. You don't compare out loud, but you compare. Everyone does. Edo fishing villages rarely encouraged open rivalry, but they didn't erase it either. Pride lived in restraint. You wanted a good catch, not to announce one. Historians still argue whether informal competition improved overall yields or quietly strained village cohesion, but you can feel its presence now, humming under the calm. As the boat moves, the water changes character again, slightly choppier, reflecting mid-morning light more aggressively. You squint, adjusting. This isn't danger, just effort. Someone near you adjusts a container lid, securing it better. A fish flops briefly, then settles. That movement reminds you how close loss always is. One careless moment and something valuable slips back into the sea. Joke number 1. The ocean has excellent customer service when it comes to returns. You think about quotas, though no one calls them that yet. Some Edo-Period villages imposed informal limits on daily catch sizes or restricted certain fishing grounds to prevent depletion. This wasn't environmentalism in the modern sense, it was survival math. If the fish disappeared, so did the village. Historians still argue how widespread and effective these practices were, but coastal records suggest at least a working awareness that the sea could be exhausted. You pass another boat heading in the opposite direction. Their catch looks lighter than yours, or maybe heavier. It's hard to tell at a distance, and you don't stare. Staring is rude. You exchange nods again. Nothing more. That's the etiquette. No bragging, no pity. Edo's social norms prized emotional moderation, especially among laborers who depended on one another. Too much pride invited resentment. Too much sympathy invited weakness. The rhythm of rowing returns. Steady and economical. Your arms are tired now in a deeper way. Not burning, just hollow. This is fatigue that doesn't complain loudly. It just settles in. Historians note that Edo-Period labor schedules rarely allowed full recovery, which may explain why endurance, not peak strength, became culturally admired. You don't push harder, you push consistently. Your thoughts drift briefly to market prices. Even out here, they matter. Certain fish fetch better prices, especially if they arrive early and fresh. Edo City markets ran on timing, and fishermen who landed too late lost value fast. This is where quiet competition sharpened. Two identical catches could mean different incomes based solely on who touched shore first. Historians still argue whether this pressure encouraged risky speed or disciplined punctuality. You suspect it did both, depending on the person. A gull cries overhead, hovering, hopeful. You ignore it. Birds aren't useful now, they're opportunists. Joke number 2. They never help with the work, but always show up for the results. You secure the containers more tightly anyway. Theft from the sky is still theft. The shoreline grows clearer as you approach. Details return. Rocks, darker water, near shallows, familiar shapes. You adjust course slightly to avoid a submerged outcrop you remember too well. Memory saves effort. Edo fishermen built mental maps not just of fishing grounds, but of return paths, because coming back tired was when accidents happened. Historians still argue whether more injuries occurred on return than departure, but anecdotal accounts suggest fatigue was a real factor. You slow as you near shallower water. Timing matters here. Land too early and you scrape. Too late and you fight the tide. You watch the waterline carefully, feeling for resistance. Someone stands, carefully balanced, ready to hop down and guide the boat in. This final coordination is wordless but precise. The day isn't over yet. As the hull touches sand, gently this time, you feel a small release in your chest. Not relief. Completion. The fishing part of the day has closed, but the work isn't finished. Edo fishermen knew better than to relax fully at this point. Landing was just a transition to another kind of labor. You step out, feet sinking into wet sand, legs stiff from hours of controlled stillness. You stretch subtly, rolling shoulders, flexing fingers. No one celebrates, no one complains. You lift the containers together, sharing weight. Cooperation doesn't end just because the sea is behind you. Behind you, the water smooths itself, already erasing signs you were there at all. Ahead of you, the village waits, ready to measure your morning in weight, smell, and silver scales. Quiet competition fades into shared necessity, at least for now. You move forward, carrying what you earned, knowing the next judgment won't come from the sea, but from shore. You don't rush the landing, even though part of you wants to. That urge to be done, to set the load down and let your arms rest, is exactly what causes slips and broken toes. You guide the boat in slowly, reading the water's resistance through your feet and calves. Edo-Period fishermen treated landings as seriously as launches, and mainstream historians agree that most equipment damage happened right here, in shallow water where people relaxed too soon. Someone hops down first, feet splashing lightly, steadying the hull. You follow, lifting rather than dragging, because dragging wears wood faster than waves ever will. The sand is cold, compacted by retreating tide, and your legs complain loudly now that they're allowed to. You ignore them. Pain acknowledged is pain doubled. That's not philosophy, that's survival. As the catch comes ashore, the atmosphere changes. The sea is still behind you, but the village has opinions. People glance over, not staring, just noticing. Children hover at a safe distance. Older villagers pretend not to look while looking anyway. Edo coastal communities were small, and privacy was a luxury nobody expected. Historians still argue whether this constant visibility strengthened social bonds or simply made everyone better at hiding emotion. You set the containers down in the shade, opening them briefly to check condition. Freshness matters. The difference between firm eyes and clouded ones can decide price later. Edo, Japan's urban demand for fish was enormous, especially in cities like Edo, where fresh seafood became a daily expectation rather than a luxury. This pressure traveled backward along the supply chain, landing squarely on your shoulders. Someone begins rinsing fish with seawater, not fresh. Fresh water was precious, and there was a belief that seawater preserved texture better anyway. That belief sits in an interesting gray zone. Some modern food scientists agree salt can slow bacterial growth briefly, while others argue the benefit was minimal. Historians still debate whether this practice was culinary insight or habit reinforced by scarcity. You sort again, more carefully this time. Market fish here, household fish there. Smaller or damaged ones set aside. Nothing is wasted. Fish unsuitable for sale might be dried, salted, fermented, or eaten immediately. Edo-Period cuisine developed largely from this necessity, not from luxury. The famous variety of Japanese seafood dishes didn't emerge from abundance. It emerged from using everything. That's a mainstream fact that tends to get romanticized later. A trader approaches, not aggressively, just present. Middlemen were a fact of life, connecting fishermen to larger markets. Whether they were exploiters or enablers is still debated by historians. Some argue they skimmed profits unfairly. Others point out that without them, fishermen couldn't move product quickly enough to matter. You don't care about theory right now. You care about timing. Negotiations are quiet. No shouting. No dramatic gestures. Prices are discussed in low voices, shaped by supply, demand, and relationships built over years. You know who pays fairly and who pushes too hard. They know how desperate you might be on a bad day. This dance is older than anyone involved. Joke number 1, capitalism doesn't need a name to function. It just shows up early and stays late. Once agreements are set, fish move fast. Baskets are lifted, carried, counted. Speed now matters more than caution. The sun is higher, and every minute changes quality. Edo fishermen lived by the clock long before industrial timekeeping reached the countryside. Historians still argue how deeply time discipline penetrated rural life, but moments like this suggest it ran deep. When the selling is done, what remains is yours. You carry it back toward the village interior, where smoke rises steadily. Cooking fires are lit. The smell of rice grows stronger. Your body shifts modes again, from outward vigilance to inward exhaustion. This transition is harder than it sounds. The adrenaline of the sea fades, leaving weight behind. You wash your hands briefly, scrubbing scales away, though the smell won't leave completely. It never does. Edo fishermen were marked by scent as much as by calluses. Some accounts suggest the smell itself became a social identifier, instantly placing someone within the village hierarchy. Historians still argue whether this carried stigma or pride. You suspect it was both, depending on the day. As you sit down, finally, the world feels closer again. Sounds sharpen, voices return. The morning's work is already being converted into meals, money, and memory. The sea is no longer in front of you, but it hasn't released you either. It never really does. You don't linger at the shore. Once the fish are sorted and handed off, your usefulness there drops fast. Crowds attract opinions, and opinions slow things down. You turn inland, following narrow paths worn smooth by decades of bare feet and load-bearing habits. This part of the day is quieter in a different way. The sea noise fades, replaced by domestic sounds, wood splitting, water sloshing, low conversation. Edo-Period fishermen lived in tight coastal villages where work and home overlapped constantly, and mainstream historians agree there was no clean separation between labor space and living space. The smell of fish follows you, clinging stubbornly. You notice it less than others do. That's adaptation. You step inside a low structure, dimmer than outside, and set down what you've kept. This is where preservation begins, and it matters just as much as catching. Fish that spoil undo the entire morning. Edo, Japan developed remarkably efficient preservation techniques, salting, drying, fermenting, out of necessity, not curiosity. That's not debated. What historians still argue is how standardized these methods were across regions versus how much variation existed, village to village. You reach for salt, coarse and plentiful. Salt was valuable but accessible in coastal areas, and fishermen used it liberally. You rub it into flesh with practiced motions, knowing exactly how much pressure and coverage each species needs. Too much ruins texture, too little invites rot. This balance isn't written anywhere. It lives in your hands. Some fringe accounts suggest fishermen judge saltiness by taste mid-process, though modern readers tend to recoil at that idea. Historians still debate how accurate those accounts are, but you wouldn't be surprised. Waste wasn't an option. Drying racks wait nearby, angled to catch breeze but avoid harsh sun. Fish are laid carefully, not touching. Space matters. Airflow matters. Edo-Period villages were essentially small-scale food processing hubs, quietly feeding urban centers while rarely getting credit for it. The famous fish markets of Edo didn't start with merchants. They started here with you, adjusting a rack by a few inches to avoid spoilage. Your shoulders sag now that the work has shifted to something repetitive and grounded. Fatigue settles deeper. Joke number one. This is the moment your body asks why you thought fishing was a good idea, and your brain responds by going completely blank. You keep moving anyway. Nearby, someone lights a small fire. Smoke curls upward, thin and steady. Smoking fish wasn't always common, but it existed, especially for certain varieties. Historians still argue whether smoking was primarily about preservation or flavor at this stage in Japanese history. Probably both, though flavor usually follows survival, not the other way around. You rinse tools again, checking nets for damage. This is non-negotiable. A torn net left unrepaired becomes tomorrow's problem multiplied. Edo fishermen devoted significant afternoon time to maintenance, and mainstream historians emphasize that this invisible labor consumed as many hours as fishing itself. It wasn't optional downtime, it was survival bookkeeping. As you mend a small tear, your fingers move faster than your thoughts. You've done this thousands of times. The knot tightens cleanly. Good. You test it gently. Strong enough. This quiet competence is rarely celebrated, but it keeps food on the table. Historians still debate whether such skill was undervalued socially compared to farming or craftsmanship, but within the village, competence mattered more than status. A simple meal appears: rice, a bit of fish, maybe pickled vegetables. You eat slowly, not ceremonially, but not rushed either. Calories matter. Edo fishermen diets were repetitive but functional, heavy on carbohydrates and protein, light on indulgence. Alcohol appears sometimes, but not now. Midday drinking dulls hands, and dull hands are dangerous later. That's not moralizing, that's experience. You sit for a moment after eating, not sleeping, just letting your body settle. True rest comes later. For now, there's still work to finish, rules to observe, and weather to consider for tomorrow. The morning's catch is already becoming yesterday's effort in your mind. Outside, the sea continues its rhythm, indifferent. Inside, you prepare for the next cycle, repairing, preserving, enduring. The day is far from over, but the hardest uncertainty has passed. What remains is work you understand, and in that familiarity, there's a quiet kind of relief. The heat settles in now, not oppressive, just persistent, like a hand resting on your back, reminding you that the day is only halfway spent. This is when the village feels smallest. Everyone is visible, everyone busy, everyone pretending not to notice everyone else. Edo-Period coastal communities ran on this kind of mutual awareness, and mainstream historians agree that social life here wasn't scheduled. It was unavoidable. You step back outside with repaired nets folded over one arm, scanning for a patch of shade that still catches enough light to work. Afternoon is for maintenance, not reflection. Reflection invites fatigue. You sit, cross-legged, and resume mending where you left off. The repetition is almost hypnotic. Thread, loop, pull, tighten, over and over. Historians still argue whether this kind of repetitive labor dulled creativity or sharpened focus, but from where you're sitting, it just keeps things functional. A breeze moves through, carrying smells of drying fish and wood smoke. These aren't pleasant exactly, but they're familiar, and familiarity lowers your guard. You have to watch that. Afternoon accidents happen when people think the dangerous part of the day is over. Joke number one: the sea may have spared you this morning, but negligence has a much better memory. Someone nearby starts sanding a plank, preparing a patch for the boat. Maintenance extends to everything: boats, nets, knives, even baskets. Edo fishermen lived inside a web of objects that all needed attention, and historians emphasize that neglecting any single piece could cascade into loss. This constant upkeep wasn't a sign of inefficiency. It was how systems survived without replacement economies. You pause to sharpen a blade, listening to the rasp of stone against metal. Sharp tools are safer than dull ones. Another counterintuitive truth learned early. A dull knife slips, a sharp one behaves. Edo-Period fishermen understood this viscerally, and some fringe accounts suggest blades were even tested against fingernails or wood grain before being trusted. Historians still debate how standardized such practices were, but nobody argues their importance. As you work, talk drifts in from nearby: weather speculation, market rumors, someone's cousin in another village who caught something impressive last week. You half listen. Information spreads like this, loosely, unevenly. There's no bulletin board, no official announcements. Knowledge moves mouth to ear, altered slightly each time. Historians still argue whether this slowed innovation or filtered out bad ideas. You suspect it did both. The afternoon light flattens shadows, making everything look simpler than it is. This is deceptive. Simplicity here is earned, not given. Every object around you represents decisions layered over years. Why that knot, not another? Why that wood, not softer grain? Edo fishermen didn't romanticize tradition. They kept what worked and quietly dropped what didn't. That's not conservatism, that's efficiency. You stretch your back slowly, feeling stiffness protest. Rest is coming, but not yet. Some fishermen napped briefly in the afternoon, others didn't. Historians still argue whether daytime rest was common or discouraged. Evidence suggests it depended on age, workload, and season. You choose to keep moving. Stopping completely makes starting again harder. A child runs past, laughing, then is sharply reminded to stay clear of tools. Life continues around your labor. This isn't a separate workplace. It's the center of everything. Edo villages didn't have the luxury of compartmentalization. Work, family, economy, and survival overlapped constantly, and historians often point out that this blurred boundary shaped social behavior more than any written rule. You finish the last repair and stack the nets neatly. That small orderliness matters. Tomorrow's fatigue will thank you. You wipe your hands on your clothing, adding new stains to old ones, and finally allow yourself to slow. The sun begins its long descent, shadows returning depth to the world. The afternoon hasn't been exciting. It hasn't needed to be. This is the backbone of the day, the uncelebrated hours that keep everything else possible. You've maintained what keeps you afloat, literally and figuratively. As the light shifts and the air cools slightly, you feel the day bend toward evening, and with it, the promise of rest that still has to be earned. Evening doesn't arrive all at once. It leaks in slowly, cooling the air and softening edges, and you feel your body respond before you consciously notice the change. This is when hunger sharpens again, not desperate, just insistent. Edo-Period fishermen ate simply, and mainstream historians agree their diets were built for endurance, not pleasure. Rice anchors the meal. Fish fills the gaps. Everything else is secondary. You sit low, close to the ground, as food is prepared nearby. No elaborate ceremony, just practiced efficiency. A small portion of the day's catch is cleaned and cooked quickly, grilled, simmered, or eaten lightly cured, depending on what's available and how tired everyone is. Freshness is assumed. If fish smells wrong, it's already failed. That blunt standard kept people alive long before refrigeration existed. You eat steadily, not fast. Eating fast makes you sluggish later, and sluggishness lingers. Edo fishermen understood energy management intuitively. Some fringe accounts mention fishermen avoiding certain fish before sleep, believing they caused restless dreams. Modern explanations would point to digestion, but historians still argue how seriously such beliefs were taken. You don't overthink it. You eat what's there. Conversation returns cautiously. Not gossip heavy, not silent either. People talk about weather patterns, tomorrow's tide, whose nets need extra repair. This is planning disguised as casual talk. Edo villages didn't hold meetings for everything. Coordination happened through proximity and repetition. Historians still debate whether this informal structure was more resilient than formal hierarchy. From the inside, it just feels efficient. Someone pours a small amount of alcohol, not much, enough to loosen muscles, not enough to dull senses. Excess drinking existed, but among fishermen, moderation was enforced by consequence. A hangover at sea wasn't inconvenient, it was dangerous. Joke number 1, nothing cures overconfidence faster than open water at dawn. As the light fades further, you wash again, more thoroughly this time. Salt dries skin, cracks form, and cracked hands invite infection. Edo-Period hygiene wasn't ignorant, it was constrained. People washed when and how they could, and historians note that coastal communities often had better access to clean water than inland villages. Still, you're careful. Your hands are tools, and tools need care. You sit back, stretching legs, rolling shoulders. The fatigue now is different from midday tiredness. It's heavier, more honest. Your body isn't asking for stimulation or distraction. It's asking for shutdown. But before that, there are rules to observe. Village norms dictate quiet hours, shared responsibilities, unspoken expectations. Edo Japan ran on these invisible rails, and historians still argue whether such social pressure was comforting or suffocating. You suspect it depended on personality. The sky deepens to blue-black. Stars emerge, faint at first, then clearer. You glance up without thinking. Navigation by stars existed, but nearshore fishermen like you relied more on landmarks and memory. Still, stars marked time, season, and repetition. They reminded you that tomorrow would arrive whether you were ready or not. You lie back eventually, on woven mats, muscles humming faintly. No entertainment, no scrolling, just the sound of night insects and distant surf. This is when reflection sneaks in, unwanted but persistent. Did you cast too early? Miss a better spot? Should you have waited longer? Historians still argue how much individual decision-making mattered in daily catch outcomes. You suspect it mattered less than people like to admit. The sea has its own plans. Sleep approaches unevenly. Not deep yet, just the edge of it, where thoughts blur and time loosens. You let it come without forcing it. Tomorrow will demand the same discipline, the same patience, the same quiet competence. For now, the day releases you, inch by inch, into darkness. Sleep never lasts as long as you want it to. It arrives gently, then leaves early, nudged aside by the subtle awareness that tomorrow is already forming. Even in rest, part of you stays alert. Edo-Period fishermen didn't have alarms, but they didn't need them either. Habit woke you. The body learned the schedule faster than the mind ever could. Mainstream historians agree that pre-industrial sleep patterns were lighter and more fragmented, especially in labor communities tied to tides rather than clocks. You wake once during the night, not fully, just enough to register sound. The surf has changed its rhythm slightly. That matters. You store the information without conscious effort and let yourself drift again. Some fringe accounts suggest fishermen believed the sea spoke at night, offering warnings or reassurance. Modern scholars argue this was simply pattern recognition layered onto half-sleep. But when your livelihood depends on subtle shifts, even dreams become data. Morning is still hours away, but rest is no longer deep. You lie still, letting muscles recover as much as they can. True recovery takes time you don't have. Edo fishermen aged quickly, not in years, but in wear. Historians still debate whether coastal populations showed more physical degeneration than agricultural ones. The evidence is mixed, but you feel the cost in your joints anyway. Eventually, night thins. Not light yet, just less dark. You rise quietly, careful not to wake others unnecessarily. Respect for shared rest was a village rule, rarely written down, but strictly observed. You step outside, cool air tightening your skin instantly. The stars are fading, and you check them automatically, noting positions. Brightness. Even if you don't navigate by them, they anchor your sense of timing. Before anything else, you check the gear again. Nets stacked neatly where you left them. Lines coiled properly. Boat resting where it should be. This ritual isn't paranoia, it's insurance. Edo fishermen trusted preparation more than luck, and historians still argue whether this mindset was cultural or simply reinforced by repeated near failures. Either way, you don't skip the check. You notice a small repair you rushed yesterday. Not broken, but sloppy. That won't do. You fix it now, fingers stiff but precise. Joke number 1, future. You is unforgiving, and present, you has learned to respect that. The knot tightens cleanly. Better. As others stir, quiet signals pass between you. Nods, brief glances, no greetings yet. Words come later. Right now, the body warms up through movement, not conversation. Someone starts a small fire. Someone else lifts a boat edge slightly to check beneath. The village transitions from rest to readiness without announcement. You test the wind again. Slight shift overnight, nothing dramatic. Still, it changes where you'll fish. Plans adjust automatically. Edo fishermen were flexible not because they liked uncertainty, but because resisting it wasted energy. Historians still debate whether this adaptability was learned individually or enforced socially. From the inside, it just feels necessary. A faint smell of rice returns, comforting and familiar. You eat lightly. Heavy meals before work slow you down. That belief was widespread, though historians still argue whether it had physiological basis or was simply tradition. Either way, you feel better keeping it small. As dawn approaches, you feel the same calm focus settle in as yesterday. Not excitement, not dread, just readiness. The cycle resets, almost seamlessly. Yesterday's fatigue hasn't vanished, but it's folded into routine now. This is how days stack into years without anyone noticing the seams. You glance once toward the dark water, still unreadable, still indifferent. The sea doesn't remember yesterday's catch. Neither can you afford to. You breathe in, steady and slow, and step back into position as the light begins to return. By now, you know the pattern so well, it almost disappears. That's dangerous in its own way. Familiarity dulls edges, and Edo-Period fishermen were constantly negotiating between routine and alertness. The village wakes around you again, but the feeling is slightly different today. Not worse, not better, just altered. Weather, mood, small variables stacking quietly. Mainstream historians agree that coastal life was shaped less by dramatic events and more by these incremental shifts that rarely made it into records. As you move through the morning preparations, you're aware of eyes on you, not judging, just noting. Social order here is subtle but firm. Experience carries weight. Younger fishermen watch how you handle gear, how you respond to conditions. Instruction is rarely explicit. You teach by example, whether you intend to or not. Historians still argue whether this apprenticeship-style learning slowed innovation or ensured reliability. You suspect reliability mattered more when failure meant hunger. The sea looks cooperative at first glance. That's never enough. You test assumptions carefully. Wind is steady, but slightly angled. Currents feel familiar, though not identical to yesterday. You adjust where you'll cast. Small changes like this separate passable days from good ones. Edo fishermen didn't chase novelty. They refined decisions endlessly. That refinement is invisible unless you know what you're looking at. As you push off again, a low cloud bank lingers farther out. Not threatening yet, but worth remembering. Storms didn't announce themselves politely, and coastal fishermen relied on early signs more than bravery. Some fringe beliefs held that certain cloud shapes were omens of misfortune. Modern historians argue these interpretations were attempts to articulate real atmospheric cues without scientific language. Either way, you file the image away. The work begins, and you fall back into rhythm. Cast, wait, retrieve. The motions are familiar, but your attention isn't lazy. You notice how the fish respond differently today. Less aggressive, more scattered. That tells you something. Maybe temperature, maybe pressure, maybe migration timing. Historians still debate how well Edo fishermen understood these patterns consciously versus intuitively. You don't label it, you adapt. Mid-morning, the wind shifts more noticeably. The boat rocks differently now, sharper, less predictable. This isn't dangerous yet, but it's a warning. You exchange looks with the others. No words needed. This is the unspoken calculus of risk. How much longer is worth it? Edo fishermen balanced necessity against caution daily, and historians still argue whether economic pressure pushed them too far at times. You lean toward caution. Fish are replaceable. Lives aren't. A sudden splash nearby jolts your focus. Not a fish breaking surface, something larger moving underneath. Predator. That changes everything. You adjust immediately, pulling in gear faster than planned. Joke number one. Nothing clarifies priorities faster than realizing you're not the biggest thing in the water. Sharks were rare, but not unheard of. More often, it was larger fish or seals. Either way, competition wasn't theoretical. The decision to leave comes cleanly. No regret, no bravado. You stow equipment efficiently, movement sharper now. The return is faster than yesterday, but controlled. Wind at your side helps, but you don't trust it. Conditions can turn quickly, and historians still argue how many fishing deaths went unrecorded because small boats disappeared quietly. You intend not to become a footnote. As shore approaches, tension eases, but doesn't vanish. You land cleanly, grateful for familiarity. The village absorbs you again, routines resuming almost seamlessly. This wasn't a dramatic day. It wasn't meant to be. It was a reminder that the sea's patience has limits. Later, as you mend a small tear caused by hurried retrieval, you think about how much of this life is judgment calls made with incomplete information. Edo fishermen weren't fearless. They were selective about when fear was useful. Historians still debate whether this pragmatism should be called wisdom or resignation. From where you sit, it's just survival with experience attached. As evening nears again, you feel the accumulated weight of repetition, not boredom, fatigue layered with understanding. You've read the sea today and adjusted your story accordingly. Tomorrow we'll ask again. It always does. By the time evening settles in again, the day feels longer than it was. Not because more happened, but because your attention never really dropped. That kind of sustained awareness is expensive. Edo-Period fishermen paid that cost daily, and mainstream historians agree that mental fatigue, not just physical exhaustion, shaped coastal life more than most records admit. You move through familiar motions as light fades, cleaning tools, stacking gear, checking lines one last time. This isn't busy work, it's insurance against tomorrow. A missed flaw now becomes a crisis later, usually at the worst possible moment. Historians still argue whether Edo villages enforced these habits socially, or whether fear of loss was enough. From your perspective, enforcement isn't needed. Consequences are persuasive teachers. The village quiets, not into silence, but into a lower register. Voices soften, footsteps slow. The sea is still audible, but distant, like it's stepped back to observe. You sit near the edge of activity, stretching hands that feel older than they should. Calluses catch slightly on fabric. That's normal. Soft hands don't last here. Stories drift through the air, half-finished sentences about past storms, near misses, unusually large catches from years ago. No one exaggerates too much. Exaggeration invites challenge, and challenge invites embarrassment. Edo culture prized restraint, and nowhere was that clearer than among people who lived at the mercy of something bigger than themselves. Historians still debate whether this understated storytelling reflected humility or social pressure. You don't analyze it, you listen. Someone mentions a fisherman from another coast who ignored warnings and didn't come back last season. The story isn't dramatic. It doesn't need to be. That's the third light joke of the day, if you can call it that. The sea doesn't require a punchline to make its point. The reminder settles quietly, reinforcing habits more effectively than any rule ever could. You eat again, lightly. Appetite fades faster as fatigue deepens. The body prioritizes rest now. Edo fishermen often ate their largest meal earlier in the day, a fact historians still discuss when analyzing labor efficiency. You don't think about it consciously. You just stop when enough feels like enough. Before sleeping, you check the sky one more time. Clouds thin, stars return. Conditions look calmer than earlier, which means tomorrow might be generous or deceptive. The sea has moods, and historians still argue whether fishermen anthropomorphized it out of belief or out of psychological necessity. Either way, you treat it like something capable of change without warning. You lie down again, muscles heavy, mind quieter than usual. There's a satisfaction here that isn't happiness. It's alignment. You did what you were supposed to do today. You adjusted when you needed to. You came back. In this life, that counts. Sleep approaches more easily now, not because the work was lighter, but because you trusted your decisions. Tomorrow we'll test that trust again. For now, the village exhales as one, and you let yourself sink into rest, knowing the cycle will resume whether you're eager or not. Morning returns the way it always does, quietly, without asking whether you're ready. Your body answers anyway. This is the final shape of the routine now, fully familiar, almost invisible. You no longer experience each step as separate actions. They blur into a single continuous motion, like breathing. Edo-Period fishermen lived inside this loop for most of their lives, and mainstream historians agree that identity here was less about individual ambition and more about reliable participation. You rise, dress, check gear, and step toward the shore with no sense of novelty left. That's not a failure. It's the goal. Novelty distracts. Familiarity keeps you alive. Historians still argue whether such repetitive lives limited personal expression or created deeper forms of quiet mastery. From where you stand, ankle-deep in cool sand, mastery feels more useful than expression. The sea greets you the same way it always does, indifferent, unreadable, waiting. You don't expect fairness from it anymore. You expect patterns, tendencies, probabilities. That expectation is realistic. Edo fishermen didn't mythologize the sea because they were naive. They did it because naming forces helped them remember risk. Modern language calls this coping. Older language called it respect. You push off once more, knowing this isn't a special day. That's what makes it important. Most lives are made of ordinary days survived competently. The catch may be good or thin. Weather may shift or hold. Tools may fail or behave. None of that changes the core task. Pay attention, adapt, return. As the boat settles into motion, you feel no urge to rush, no urge to prove anything. Younger fishermen still glance your way, not because you're exceptional, but because you're consistent. Historians still debate how authority functioned in Edo fishing villages, formal titles versus earned trust, but out here, consistency speaks louder than instruction. You cast, wait, retrieve. Again, the cycle doesn't bore you. It steadies you. You know now that this rhythm is the real inheritance passed down coastlines. Not just techniques, but temperament. A way of meeting uncertainty without dramatizing it. When you finally turn back toward shore, there's no sense of ending, only continuation. Today feeds tomorrow feeds memory. The village absorbs your effort the way it always has, quietly converting labor into survival. You step onto land, carrying what the sea allowed, and for a moment, just a moment, you understand that this life was never about conquering nature. It was about learning how not to fight it unnecessarily. Word count, 1021. The evening comes softly now, slower than before, as if the day itself is tired with you. Movements lose their sharp edges. Sounds stretch out and blur together. The distant surf, a low voice, the soft rustle of wind moving through grass near the shore. You no longer track details. You let them pass through you. Your body sinks into rest the way a boat settles into still water after motion. Muscles loosen. Thoughts drift apart, no longer forming plans or questions. Tomorrow exists, but not urgently. It can wait. The sea is still there, breathing steadily, doing what it has always done. It doesn't demand anything from you right now. Neither does the village. Neither does time. You lie still, warmth returning to your hands, your breathing slow and even. The day folds itself away, not disappearing, just stacking neatly with all the others before it. Nothing needs solving tonight. Nothing needs deciding. Just rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.